Okay, today on Gear in Review, I was asked by one of my friends, Andy, this video is for you. I was asked to shoot a video on effects loops. Okay. Well, and I was asked to kind of like do this demo and pretty much explain it for someone who doesn't know what an effects loop is, so everybody else don't be offended. I'm not trying to talk down to anybody or anything like that. I'm just like I said, I was asked to do this in a way that, you know, people that didn't know what an effects loop was or have an idea about how to use the effects loop will get something out of this video. So here it goes in a nutshell. The effects loop, basically, and it can get a lot more complex than that, I'm sure. If you talk to some amp builders, it gets a lot more complex than that. But for us amp for dummy guys like myself, the effects loop is basically a break in the signal path between the preamp section and the power section. This allows you to introduce time-based effects after the preamp section into your signal chain. You can add I've heard people tell people before that you can't put certain effects in your effects loop, and it's not true. It's totally not true that you can't put those things in your. You can put anything you want to in your effects loop for the most part. Now, how it will react is different, but I've heard things about damaging the amp and burning out your tubes, and if you set anything up with just the smallest modicum of common sense, you're not gonna screw anything up. I had a guy tell me once that you can't put an EQ in the effects loop. That is the falsest thing I've ever heard. You know, the guy was like, "Oh yeah, if you put an EQ in your effects loop, you're gonna burn your tubes up." These people don't seem to understand that these amps are designed, a lot of them are designed to use your effects loop also as a signal boost. So how is sending a hotter signal to, or an increased output to the power tubes, going to damage the amp when the amp is designed to send a hotter signal to the output tubes? That statement makes absolutely no sense. Even if it were true, if you get the right type of EQ pedal, like the MXR 10-band EQ pedal, not only has a gain control on it, it has a level control. Set your effect up to unity gain, and you're not sending any hotter of a signal to the power tubes than what was being sent there before. The fact that the signal's distorted, if it were something that had introduced some distortion to the signal, it's not going to damage the tubes because your preamp is sending distorted signal to the power tubes. I'm not saying these things will sound great. I'm just saying people have described effects loops and used terms that are incorrect, as to say it'll damage or it can't be done. Not saying it can't be done. It may not be able to be done with positive effects, and what a positive effect for that is determined by what you're wanting to get out of putting it there. What one person calls ratty tone, another person is in love with. What one person calls, you know, round and full-bodied, another person will say is dull and lifeless. They're just words that we try to use to describe something, but in the end, it means absolutely nothing because everybody's ear is different. And depending on what style of music you're playing, an aggressive, ratty type tone may be something you're going for. If you're in an industrial band, that might be something you're going for. So something that goes in your effects loop that kind of makes it a little more ratty, it's not really going to bug you that much. Anyway, enough of that. Back onto the effects loop. You could put, for the most part, they call for time-based effects. I usually in my effects loop do use things that generally are called to be on the floor in front of the amp. I.e., I usually do put EQ pedals in my effects loop. I always put my delay and my chorus in my effects loop. Delay is always known to be in the effects loop. A lot of people say that chorus and flanger should be in the front. I think chorus and flanger sound so much better and more lush when they're actually in the effects loop. But that's just me. I have used with very good results. I've used an exotic EP booster in the effects loop. There's just, there's lots of things that can go in an effects loop. But now we're going to talk about what the effects loop actually is. And as I stated earlier, it's a break in the signal path between the preamp and the power amp, allowing all the signal from your preamp, all your EQing from here goes out through the effects loop send and returns to the amp in the effects loop return. The regular signal path is here, and it keeps going this way, like that imaginary line that keeps going this way, and these would be the ports for your effects loop. Your signal is doing like this when there's nothing in the effects loop or when the effects loop's not active. When the effects loop is active, your signal is going from the preamp out into whatever device you got it in, back in to the power amp. And that's all. Now, the different types of effects loop. You have two basic types of effects loop. You have a series effects loop and you have a parallel effects loop. A series effect loop is what you find on a lot of amps, and in basically that just means that the entire signal from your preamp goes, the entire signal goes out of the effects loop through your device and back in to your effects loop to your power section. The entire signal in that series. If you have a parallel effects loop, that means that when the effects loop is not used, 100% of your signal is flowing from the preamp to the power section. But when you activate the effects loop, a portion, only a portion of this signal is coming out into the effects loop and coming in. So you always have an amount of pure amp signal going through from the preamp section to the power section. Now the difference of these two effects loop are very important depending upon what you're putting in there. It's like when people say, so which is better, series or parallel? Well, which is better depending on what you want to put in it, which is what I love about this amp. Not to plug the amp, but what I love about the Carbon V3 is it has a series and a parallel. So regardless of what I want to put in there, I can use it. I've had to not use effects with certain amps because they only had one or the other. Let's talk about parallel. Parallel effects loop, which is the one I told you sends a portion of the signal out to the effects loop and blends it back in to the original signal. And that's really good to me for using delay and chorus, because you can get a really lush effect, but you still have the integrity of the original signal holding the tonal quality of your note together. That's really important. What it's not good for is if you're one of these type of people that likes to put an effects loop, if you're one of these people that likes to put a noise suppressor in your effects loop, it doesn't work so well, because there's always an amount of distorted signal or noisy signal that's bypassing the effects loop and still going to the power section. So you're only able to kill a portion of the noise ratio. So noise suppressors in parallel effects loops don't work as well as they would in a series where the entire signal is coming out through the effects loop and going through your device. Now, as far as delays and choruses, you can use them successfully in parallel or series. It doesn't matter. And some players that have amps that do have effects loops don't use them. Do you need to use an effects loop? Okay. Easy question to answer for me. For you, it's going to be different because you're going to have to get your pedals, lay them out. You're going to have to do a little bit of trial and error. I hate, and I mean despise, the sound of delay before distortion, because the repeats sound dirty, and it just gets, to me it just sounds kind of nasty. I like the sound of the distorted signal going into delay, and I have the same thing with chorus. So now, if you also, now I have to back up. Now I said that to also say that I prefer the sound of the gain inside of an amp as opposed to the gain on a pedal. I like to use pedals to boost what's already here, but I really usually like starting with somewhat of a gain structure already going on. Now right now, since I've got the V3, I'm not running any distortion pedals whatsoever. It's just this is just the amp and an MXR carbon copy, and that's all I'm running right now. But if you don't, if you like the sound of distortion in your amp and you don't like the sound of delay or time-based effects before distortion, which generally tend to sound bad, and as a general rule of thumb, it's usually not the way you wire a pedal board, but if that's the way you feel, then of course the effects loop is where you're going to want your delay and your chorus to go. Now, if you're a clean player and you don't tend to usually use any distortion, it doesn't matter. It basically matters on what you think sounds better. Do you think it sounds better in front of the amp or in the effects loop? I can pretty much tell you just from the people I've talked to, in general, and this doesn't apply to everybody, but in general, but if you're like one of those kind of clean players or you're a traditionalist player, 9 times out of 10, you're going to want it on the floor and out of the effects loop. I just find that those guys really tend to be real strict on the effects loop sucks gain. I, on the other hand, no matter what type of thing I'm playing, a make it or break it for me on an amp is whether or not it has an effects loop. I really like the sound of my time-based effects in an effects loop, and that's probably why I generally tend to play more modern equipment, even though my ear likes more vintage style equipment better. But there's just not the options that I need on those. So once again, that brings you to whatever it is that you're going to need to do what you're doing. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this carbon copy, MXR carbon copy. I'm going to play this without changing the settings, just to kind of give you an idea. But I'm going to play it a small passage through the parallel effects loop. Then I'm going to play through the series effects loop, and then I'm going to play it through the front of the amp. Now you will find when I play it through the parallel, I'm going to leave all the every setting the same. The delay time, the regeneration are the same. What I will have to change, however, is the mix. When you're playing through a parallel effects loop, you tend to dime out the mix on your effect so that the effect is running a completely wet signal. And then you use the mix on the amp to mix in how much of the wet signal you're sending back to the amp. So when I'm running through the parallel, the mix on the pedal is maxed, and I'm using the amp to mix in how much I want. I got it run 20% mix here. It's not going to be very strong on in the parallel, so I'm gonna run. I got it set for 20% mix inside the parallel. When I go to series, I'm gonna set the pedal for a 20% mix, and then when I come to the front end, I'll still leave it at 20% mix, and we should get roughly a general idea of pretty much the same type of mix on all different forms. So here we go. This is the. Let me get my thing right. This is parallel. this is series. This is through front end. Now that's with the, see how much with the delay in front of the distortion, you can hear that the repeats just sound kind of, they don't sound clean. And it distorts when you when the notes come together. There's some dissonance that comes in. Hear that? That right there. That little distorted repeat, or that little distorted dissonance in the echo is what I don't like, which is why I don't run one in front of distortion. But basically, now that's the difference. Now, if I put it on the clean channel, you can get a little bit better idea without the distortion. But you can hear it. Just doesn't. To me, the repeats sound cleaner when they're in the effects loop. Even on, to me, it just sounds better in the effects loop. The effect sounds more toneful. It sounds more musical and not quite as abrasive as it sounds when it's on the floor hitting the front of the amp. See? And the repeats tend to come slightly underneath the original note instead of almost, you know, right there with it, so it doesn't get in the way of the next note being played. And this is series right here. And that's series. This is parallel, which I like better. Now, the difference is when you go to parallel, you see how much lower that got? That's because I've got the pedal set at only 20% mix, and I've got the amp set on only for about 20% mix. When you put it in parallel, that's why you have to turn the mix all the way up so that you're mixing in a completely wet signal. Then you get something similar to what we had with 20% on the pedal before. Cranked it. Makes it back to 75. Just only because I don't feel like going to the rear down. So that in a nutshell is the difference between the different effects, types of effects loops, and how to hook one up. And another thing that an effects loop can be used for that people have really started doing a lot now is like you could take like your modeling effects, your modeling pedals, or your modeling rack pieces, and you can plug it in directly to the return of the effects loop. And what that does is you plug your guitar into the modeling whatever, whether it be the like a Pod 500 or Pod 500 HD or 11 rack or whatever you're using, you know, or Axe Effects, you know, whatever you're using. You plug the guitar into it. Then you go from the output of it into the return of your effects loop. And what you're doing is you're completely removing the preamp section of your amp. So there's nothing there to color the signal. and then alter it from the way it's supposed to sound. Because usually when you plug into the front end of an amp, you've got the preamp of your modeling stuff fighting with the preamp that's already built into your amp. Because these amps, no matter how you turn these knobs, these amps are tuned to a certain way. That's why different amps sound a different way. You can't turn every knob at 12 o'clock on every amp and they sound the exact same, because each preamp and each amp is kind of actually tuned or engineered to sound a certain way. But the way to get past that is to go in through the return, and that way you're only using the power section. You use the preamp section of your pedal or your modeling gear, and you use the amp just to run it and send the power to the speakers. And a lot of people are doing that now, which also goes into that whole thing where I was saying, where people say you can't put certain pedals in your effects loop because you damage the amp. Obviously that's not true if you can do that. So my advice on the effects loop is experimentation. I hope this helped clear up any questions that my friend had about effects loops. Like I said, this video was really shot for my friend, for one person. So anybody else that gets anything out of this, that's awesome. But I actually really, so don't give me a whole bunch of, hate mail or anything for this crazy video. But yeah, I basically shot this video for, one individual person. So Andy, hit me up on Facebook and let me know if I did a good job, and let me know if this helped you out any. And after that, this is Gillen H2O. This has been Gear and Review. This has been basically my rundown of an effects loop.